Welcome to the Shadow Warrior podcast. I'm the host, Rajiv Srinivasan, a professor of innovation and strategy in India and a columnist. Episode 101 is titled The US and China is a condominium between them coming up. And the reason this is interesting is because, as we all know, there is a lot of conflict going on between them and potential conflict. Everybody's talking about world wars and stuff like that. But there is another possibility that relatively few people have considered, and that's exactly what I'd like to look at today. Therefore, let me just jump into my slides and share them on this podcast. There you go, slideshow. So the point that I'd like to make is that there is a potential option, which is that a US-China condominium will be constructed. Okay, so let's consider the usual scenarios that most people are talking about. The one that's got the most mileage is something that Graham Allison, a professor at Harvard University, came up with called the Thucydides trap, which harks back to what happened between Athens and Sparta many years ago. And I think he analyzed a bunch of other situations where great powers were in conflict. One was rising and the other was falling. And most of the time, it apparently led to actual war. So that is the Thucydides trap, which suggests that these two contenders for the top spot will fight with each other and, in fact, end up kind of destroying, at least to a certain extent, each other's economies. So that's one. The second possibility is that what happened to Britain in the 20th century may happen to America in this century. There is a genteel decline because it's no longer able to align the forces of the global economy and global military and so on in its favor as the so-called, liberal international order, rules-based order is kind of fraying at the edges, as we all know. So the third possibility is that China, everybody's been expecting a linear continuation of their growth over the last few 20 years or so after they joined the WTO and succeeded so well in increasing their GDP. Is that necessarily true? There are some possibilities, for example, their demographic decline, maybe even a demographic collapse there, and that could end up creating some problems for them. So that's a third possibility. But the fourth possibility is that the two continue to be contenders and they arrive at a modus vivendi and a condominium, which I will explain the word itself. And the idea is that you end up with spheres of influence and you end up dividing up the world into two different spheres of influence, which you lord over. So this is not a completely unusual concept. It's been done before. And so let's take a look at it. What is the actual definition of a condominium? It says a joint definition, sorry, a joint dominion by two or more nations. Oh, the best known, I imagine, is the one that was brokered by the Vatican in 1494, where via the Treaty of Tordesillas, it divided up the world between Spain and Portugal. Now, I had thought this was the result of a papal bull, but when I investigated, no, it wasn't a bull, it was an actual treaty. So why shouldn't the Vatican itself or some other third party come up with an honest broker arrangement so that the US and China can go into a condominium? Now let's see some other instances where there have been such condominiums in the past. Britain and France ruled over Egypt in just a year or two, 1875 and 76. And then Britain and Egypt had one for a long time over Sudan, which um, it ended up perhaps causing some problems because we know that right now, as we speak, there are some issues in Sudan, and there is sort of an internal war. There's sort of a civil war going on. But anyway, not sure that had anything to do with the condominium. Just pointing out that these existed. These are the ones that I'm aware of. There must be others where two powers divide up, their spheres of influence over a particular entity. But what I'm suggesting here is that the most obvious spheres of influence would be that the Americas, North and South, would belong to the US and Western Europe as well. And on the other hand, Asia, the rest of Asia, and Africa, and the Indian Ocean will probably go to China, whereas the Pacific and the Atlantic will be largely American lakes. Now, this leaves some parties out of the picture. Russia, for instance, which certainly has some geopolitical interest in all this. India, which of course is my primary concern. What will happen to an Asia where China is the hegemon and it really tries to push everybody else down that is even a potential challenger, such as China, such as Japan, and certainly India. And of course, Taiwan, better, the less said about Taiwan, the better. The bottom line is that if this condominium happens, then these countries are absolutely on their own. And there is some question about the Anglosphere in Oceania. I suspect that because of the old blood ties that they have to the US, the what is it, the Five Eyes and so forth. So they probably be part of the US sphere of influence, AUKUS, etc. So this is a graphic that I found with The Economist from some other context, but it seemed to me a pretty good depiction of what the condominium would look like. Asia and Africa to China, with some parts of Europe, I guess, moved over to the American sphere, and then Americas and those oceans under American control. Now, let now I've made this assertion, but let's try and understand why this may in fact be the right solution for the two contenders. They may not want to go for conflict, which is, as I said, the most obvious scenario in the Thucydides trap. The first aspect is demographics. We have all heard about how China is suffering from a demographic decline. Now, there is some evidence that the Americans are also beginning to suffer from that, which is surprising because they've always been a nation of immigrants and they've managed to renew and refresh their youth. But there is a bit of a problem now. We'll look into that. There is a significant amount of codependency on the money side. The US, as you can see in this chart here that I've picked up from trading economics, the US has an extraordinarily high external debt of $24 trillion, whereas China has foreign reserves of $3.1 trillion, which of course is held in American Treasury bonds and Treasury securities. So this is a codependency because the Chinese would hate it if the US dollar falls and the value of their holdings goes down. And of course, the Americans, they're benefiting from holding everybody else's reserves. That's where the 24 trillion comes from. So the two of them probably don't want to change the status quo. That is an assumption I'm making because it's going to make life difficult for everybody. And as it is, the banking crisis is something that's made everyone nervous. The third point, which of course is obvious, is that the supply chain after manufacturing migrated to China, supply chain is something that the Americans have worried about, but not pretty much left alone. They've not done much about it. There is a tremendous supply chain dependence, and I imagine it's difficult for many companies to migrate out of China. It's just not convenient. And the Chinese have a strong core competence there. And finally, there is continuing evidence that the money people in America, both Wall Street as well as CEOs, are continuing to look at China as their number one option because, first of all, they've invested a lot there. Second, for the CEOs, they all like the China price, which is generally lower than what they would be able to get in America if manufacturing were to come back to America. And of course, there's a big question as to whether manufacturing will come back, considering that it has been migrated over the last 20 years and that the supply chain competence of China is not at all in doubt. They're really good at it. Although you see, for example, some leading companies like Apple migrating out to other countries such as Vietnam, to some extent India, etc. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's better for both parties in their own interests to not go to war. I mean, war is not nice, to put it mildly. And we're talking about serious nuclear war here. So nobody actually wants that. So that's one reason why I think a condominium arrangement may, in fact, make a lot of sense. Now, I said that the demographics are no longer in favoring the Americans. This was a surprise to me, and apparently a surprise to Larry Summers also, who used to be a big shot, and he was president of Harvard University, I believe, and so on. And so he said, he made this interesting comment that the first sign of trouble in Russia was when they started declining demographically. So he says this is really bad news. And the bad news is that life expectancy in the US has fallen, and it's falling much faster than in other countries that are comparable, other wealthy Western white countries. And even if you take out the effect of COVID, which is in the rightmost corner, life expectancy is basically plateaued and it's declining. What this means is that there are a lot of people dying in the US, more than the fair share. And it turns out that a lot of it is due to young people who are dying in large numbers, on the one hand, due to accidents and automobile accidents, but also um, ominously due to addiction. Fentanyl, for example, is, I don't know, something like 100 times more addictive than heroin. And a lot of people, and I haven't seen San Francisco, but I understand that San Francisco has become an absolute devastated looking place because of the number of drug addicts on the streets. So this is happening, and if it's beginning to affect American demographics, it's not a good thing for them. Now, clearly, if you look at the industry part of it, Americans have ceded their power to the Chinese ever since they joined WTO about 20 years ago or 30 years ago. I forget. Yeah, 2001, I think. So here you see how manufacturing essentially came to a stop, in the sense that there's no new capacity going in after 2000 when China joined WTO. Although there have been some changes in the last year, especially after very large incentives started to be offered. I think there is the CHIPS Act, and then there is the IRA Act. These are all things that are attempting to bring manufacturing back to America, although I'm not sure they're going to be all that successful because there is inertia. And the Chinese are, as I mentioned before, are very good at manufacturing. So unless you can get something equally good, any amount of flag waving and patriotism is maybe potentially not going to work. So this is a major issue. So America, which used to be the big manufacturing power, is no longer there. And I picked up a few other news articles. China, recognizing that there might be some issues, is now looking to set up shop in the US. They also don't want to rock the boat. If the price of peace and tranquility is that they invest in America, hey, I think they're willing to do that rather than go to economic and military war with them. But on the other hand, the Chinese market is going to be out of bounds to everybody. The Chinese are now pushing out, especially as they move into into electric cars, electric vehicles. They're pushing out the traditional car makers such as the Japanese and the Germans and the Americans out of their market. So this is again a reason why you may not want to go to war with them, because a lot of the profits from your automobile companies are coming from China. And this fellow, James Crabtree, is a Financial Times guy. He used to be in India, where he used to lecture us on all sorts of things, but now he's gone to China, or I think he's in Singapore, but looking after China. And he paints this picture where it's essentially impossible for you to migrate your manufacturing out of China. And China is also doing other things like, for example, electric vehicles need some rare earths minerals, and also lithium and nickel and so forth. And the Chinese are trying pretty hard to ensure that those things don't become available elsewhere so that they can maintain a quasi monopoly on those. And then the last part of it is that, as I mentioned, America's money men are sort of like lemmings. They're running after China, which is sort of like a Pied Piper. And here are some examples of that. One is that, yeah, the what might be called the petro yuan, the petro renminbi, that is the use of the Chinese currency as a store of value for international trade is increasing. And the lemming part of it, these guys are, when they say they're going to focus on overseas investments, that actually means China rather than any other place, because the Wall Street people have been extremely keen on investing in China. They've put a lot of their money there, and they don't want to jeopardize those funds. Although there is some danger of the Chinese actually nationalizing some of these investments because their laws are set up so that they can do that. But the short-term views of both Wall Street and CEOs in the US suggest that they'll continue to take the risk of investing more in China. So what I've done is I've given you a number of reasons why there might be some push to come up with a via media a modus vivendi so that the Americans and the Chinese can sort of divide up the world between themselves. Now, when I mentioned this to somebody who was reading a draft of this article earlier that I wrote for First Post, they said, "Wait, why on earth would America, which is now dominating the entire world, be contented to dominate only half the world and let China dominate the other half?" It's a very good question. Why would anybody ever give up power voluntarily? Okay. Now, my belief is that there are several reasons. America used to be absolutely dominant in every possible way. But now that gap between the US and others is beginning to shrink a little bit. First, if you look at the military, it's true that the American military budget is more than the next five countries put together, although we don't know about the Chinese. You know, they probably have a lot of black budget where they don't reveal their spending on military purposes. And of course, they're building a massive blue water navy, which is a big threat to India, because bottom line is that India will have to figure out how to increase its coverage of the Indian Ocean with a bunch of nuclear submarines and, I don't know, maybe a couple of aircraft carriers, although I'm not absolutely sure that that's the right thing, because these become sort of sitting ducks with hypersonic missiles and whatnot. But anyway, so the Americans have this massive budget and they have all the high-tech gadgets, but the outcomes of war have not been all that great. You know, we go back to the Vietnam War and then the Afghanistan War, and we have these relatively unstructured and sort of ragtag groups. They end up defeating the Americans, okay, partly because there are proxy entities supporting the other side, perhaps. But in any case, I think the writing is on the wall with Ukraine also. I don't think they're going to be able to win, or certainly they're not going to be able to win that easily. So the outcome on a military side, on the military side, the military perspective, has not been that great as far as American capability is concerned. Secondly, we've all heard about the problems in the banking sector in the US, and there are other reasons to believe. One is the total sort of deindustrialization on the consumer goods side. When I first moved to the US some years ago, everything used to be made in America, and that was a guarantee of quality and so on. But by the time I left, or now if I go back there, I see that the vast majority of consumer goods are made in China, or clothing is made in Bangladesh, etc. It's true that they continue to gain advantage and maintain a lead in high-tech items and in military items and in things like planes and whatnot. But the amount of American goods that are flowing around the world is now diminished. That's one. The second is that the fact that the American dollar has been the reserve currency, where people do two things. One is they trade in dollars between two third countries. Their trade is demarcated in dollars. Secondly, a lot of, as I said earlier, a lot of foreign countries maintain their reserves in America. So these are both things that contribute to the demand for the US dollar. But lately we're hearing a bunch of things that put that in jeopardy. Like, for example, the BRICS group are planning to bring out their own currency. And after the sanctions on Russia, they've started encouraging third country currency transactions. For example, I think India and Russia are trading in oil, in rupees through Dubai or something. So if the American dollar falls from its pedestal as the reserve currency of the world, that's going to have some pretty bad implications. So, the economy is also something that's not as strong an arena for America as it used to be. And the third thing, it's kind of more abstract, but the culture wars that we see every day in America, the Republicans and the Democrats fighting like cats and dogs over everything, abortion and anything you mention, any topic that you can mention, they're fighting unnecessarily. There's a lot of acrimony, but even more than that, this entire woke industry, including all these identity issues, they don't at this point know who's a man, who's a woman, and all those strange things that seem to preoccupy America. And this is actually having an impact on their soft power because for the last 50, 60 years, American soft power with Hollywood and Levi's jeans and things like that was the norm. But I'm beginning to wonder, like, for example, you now have K-pop, which has taken some of the shine away from American rock music. And then I hear that Thai movies are becoming popular, etc. So in all these three areas, America's hitherto insurmountable lead has now taken a beating. And here is an example of one of those culture war issues. We all know that former President Trump, was indicted, and that sends a pretty bad message because I think the the alleged reason for the indictment was pretty flimsy. He could probably have been indicted on a variety of other more substantive issues, but the one that they chose, payments to a call girl, I mean that's kind of trivial sounding. And anyway, it just shows that America is not any longer seen as a haven or a haven of proper democratic procedures and norms. The dollar, according to the Wall Street Journal, still looks safe, but we don't know. It may not continue to be there. As you can see, is no longer accounting for more than 60% of reserves, and people may slowly start taking their money out. As I said, not the Chinese, but others may do that. And this is again from a very, I guess, astute observer, acute person, acute observer. That's Professor Mead, Walter Russell Mead at the Wall Street Journal, and he says that, and I agree with him. This internal problems are now affecting foreign policy stances as well, and a number of things have hurt the American brand around the world, including the most recent thing, which is again mentioned. The most recent thing was the huge leak of Pentagon documents that happened a few days ago. That has made America look pretty bad from a variety of perspectives I will not go into, but allies may also be looking at America and wondering, is there a plan B? Do we need a plan B? And this again is Walter Russell Mead saying that if the American umbrella, the nuclear umbrella, and the possibility that America will come to your rescue is going to be discounted a little bit by third parties, they will look for a plan B. And I believe Europe is already, Emmanuel Macron got a lot of flack for going to China and saying that we shouldn't follow the American lead necessarily, which is interesting. But it's showing that even long-term Western European allies, NATO countries, are rethinking their allegiance, or not allegiance, at least their tendency to be following the Americans 100% on everything. You remember that France was a strong, or is a strong supporter of America on Ukraine, but there are rumblings there as well. Other countries are now beginning to wonder how wise a move that was. So I think to put it in a nutshell, it turns out that because of decline in both military and economic terms, and in particular in its soft power, it may well be the case that America will, looking at all issues on the table, say that, look, we're better off with a power sharing agreement with China rather than going into a conflict. Now, this is not good for everybody. They may go for it. They'll look after their own interests, which of course they're entitled to do. But it's pretty bad for the rest of us here. India, certainly, it's not a good idea if you have this hegemonistic China breathing over our shoulders. Japan is not going to be happy. Taiwan obviously is going to be in deep trouble. So, what is the answer? Well, we have to figure it out for ourselves and help ourselves. Thank you very much.